Thank you for joining us on Silently Bleeding Hope for the Pastor's Wife. I'm your host, Jan McIntyre. Today, our special guest is Connie Czepiel. Welcome, Connie.
Thank you so very much. It's a joy to be here.
Well, I'm excited to share Connie's story with you today. Connie has written a book. It's called Wounded No More. We're going to be talking about this book and many subjects in this book, and it is an individualized plan to heal church wounds. And if you've been in church for any amount of time, there's a chance that maybe you've had a little wound, and for some of us, big wounds, because people are people even inside the church. So, Connie, what is your story?
Well, that somebody said to me once, great testimonies are a whole lot easier to tell than they are to live, right? I just want to preface it with that. And everybody has their own individual healing journey. It's not like a formula. But I'm excited to say I'm beyond my church wounds, and I'm excited for you that you will also. Uh, there's time. There's a time for healing, and it will happen because when you're in the middle of it, a lot of times it feels like it'll never end. So my own church hurt centered around a very unwanted and unexpected divorce, and also then farther down the road, some emotional problems that came up that I had not dealt with before, leading to related to childhood sexual abuse. So anyway, my story is that I was married with three children. We had three children in 16 months. My daughter was 16 months old, and we had twin sons. So
Wow.
we were very busy people. My husband was in the military at the time, so I'd been a stay-at-home mom for quite a while. And all of a sudden, when the boys were 6 and my daughter was 8, my husband ran off with another woman.
Mm.
She also was married and had 3 kids. So it was just this horrible situation, 6 kids involved, 2 families involved. And so it was very hurtful. And then also, a divorced person's experience in the church is far different. And so it's, those things happen. I don't want to go real deep into that because I really want to get onto the healing part to share with your audience.
Okay, thank you. So, Connie, how did you find healing from your church hurt?
There's just a whole long list, and I'll just mention a few and then circle around and dig more deeply into one if that's okay.
Sure.
Um, I think, that your mindset really, really has to change. There's the ministry of the Holy Spirit. I would never have made it without him. Um, there's professional counseling and prayer, being around like-minded people that have been through some of the same things that what you're doing here, even with the pastor's wives. And, learning to serve others and getting outside of myself because our world gets very, very small when we're in the midst of a lot of hurt and pain. And sometimes one of the final steps in healing is to serve others, which is hard to do sometimes. Um, but I want to circle back to mindset, if that's okay. I think it takes a whole lot of grit and determination to get through these things. We have to decide that giving up is not an option. Um, I go back to that verse where when Jesus was going into Jerusalem, he knew he was going to be crucified, but he set his face like flint towards Jerusalem. For what reason? For the joy that was set before him. So I
Mhm.
want to encourage you, there's more joy on the other end of your problem. And I had to realize it wasn't just about me. I had to overcome a lot of this because I had 3 kids to think about. I hadn't worked in 10 years. Like I said, I'd been a stay-at-home mom. I was concerned about my own destiny because I knew that I had a calling on my life and I didn't want this whole thing to ruin it. Um, but a particular phrase really kept me going. And I don't know if this book is even in print anymore. It's called Tough Times Never Last, but Tough People Do. And it was written by Robert Schuller of the Crystal Cathedral, for those that remember that. And a phrase in there has kept me so many times in the midst of problems. He said, problems never leave us the way they found us. They either make us bitter or better. Let me say that again. Problems never leave us the way they found us. They will either make us bitter or better. And we need to decide in the very middle how we want to come out at the other end. So I had to think about what do I want my life, my heart, and my character to look like at the other end of this, the other side of this. So that really helped me. And of course, there's the Holy Spirit. And really encourage people to concentrate on praise and worship, which is kind of the last thing you want to do when you're in the middle of a problem. You're going like, "Oh my word, that's the last thing I feel like doing." Um, but that's where a sacrifice of praise comes in. And even if you just are in the middle of praise and worship, just raise your hand, even if you don't sing, just be in that atmosphere. Because God said that He inhabits the praises of His people. And for myself, in the midst of that, He gave me two different visions that really, really did a lot of healing in the heart. So those are the things I kind of wanted to share with you.
Connie, in your opinion, why do you think there's so much church hurt? And why do you think it gets swept under the rug many times?
Gosh, that's such a I could talk for hours about that. I think that I really want to, I'll try to share some things that God showed me. And that's, first of all, our churches are too often built on something other than kingdom principles. You know,
Mm.
it's about church growth models, it's about entertainment, it's about being sure not to offend people. It's about a lot of things other than promoting the kingdom. And I think too often we're Christians in name only. And it says in the word that in the end times, people will have a form of religion but deny the power thereof. So we kind of deny the power of God to change our lives for the good. And we don't also want to confront sin in the church. We don't want to hold people accountable. But this was one real insight that really, really helped me understand. And that is that people are living incongruent lives. What I mean by that? What I mean is that our beliefs and our behaviors don't line up with each other. And so we say we believe something, but our lives show something different.
Mm.
And if we have a conscience at all, we can't keep living that way. And sooner or later, something has to go. And unfortunately, it's usually our beliefs that have to go because we don't want to give up our behavior. So then we start down this slippery slope. It's like, we kind of put our toe into sin, and then next thing you know, we get deeper and deeper and deeper into sin. And next thing you know, we're doing things we never dreamed we were even capable of doing. And then at that point, several things can happen. Either a person, you know, will finally give it up and get rid of their behavior and get back on the straight path, or some people never can do that and they literally crack mentally. There's suicides, there's things like, and if it keeps going, sooner or later it'll be exposed. So that's what we're seeing before our very eyes today, right? So it's almost like somebody has made a different decision about their beliefs along the way, kept that kind of hidden and kept doing their behavior. So these are difficult things. And I think to sweep it on the rug, people, sadly, I don't know, it's human nature, but leaders and other people don't want anybody to rock the boat. They want the status quo. So whistleblowers and truth tellers, they rock the boat. And we've seen it before our very eyes when somebody says, hey, there's a problem here. Sometimes leadership or other people want to marginalize that person, shame that person, you know, ruin their character, how dare you bring this up type of thing. I literally was in a congregational meeting one time, and a lady asked a very legitimate question, and the pastor just put her down. He says, I don't run this church by committee and I'm led by the Spirit, and just totally shamed her. And I was just
Mm.
embarrassed to be there. It's like, that ain't okay.
Right.
And I think, people don't want to be held accountable. And I don't know, those are my first thoughts. And also I think what happens too often is we have a lack of authenticity. Like, we come into church, hi, how are you? I'm fine. How are you? I'm fine. And we go on our way, and nobody wants, and I'm not sure I fully understand this, but it's like we're almost ashamed, or we don't want to be honest with people and say, hey, I'm going through a struggle, everything isn't okay. And so then we tend to put on sort of a church face or whatever, and everything's fine, you're fine, I'm fine. You know what I mean? And
So the biggest lies are told on Sunday sometimes.
yeah,
Great.
it's true.
When on
And
the inside, we are silently bleeding.
exactly. And And I think there's also a lack of time in our society. It's like we don't want to get involved in other people's problems or sort of feel like, I got enough on my own plate. I mean, honestly, it takes time, it takes commitment to build relationships and to walk together and, walk along beside other people and so forth. And, especially with men and women both working, they really, treasure the time they have alone with their family and they don't want to be bothered. And that's just a sad fact, I guess.
Yes, yes. Connie, I've learned to say if I'm not okay, like if I'm having a rough time when I go to church, and I am a pastor's wife and a pastor, I'm not going to go and be like, oh, just everything's falling
Right.
apart. But I'll
Exactly.
say, by God's grace, I'm okay. And the funny thing is, people go, oh, great.
Yeah.
But if they really listen to what I'm saying, because if I'm doing well, I'm like, I'm good. Thank you so much for asking. But if I say I'm okay, by God's grace, I'm okay, that says something's going on. I'm not saying what it is, but there's a little going on. So, you
Sure.
could be praying for me. But like you said, we're so busy that sometimes we don't take time to really listen and hear what somebody's really saying.
Yes. I think that's very true.
So, Connie, how can pastors' wives make a difference in their church in helping bring hope and healing to the wounded?
Yeah, I think part of it is to lead by example, to be a good listener, like you're just talking about, to be real, to be authentic, to be vulnerable, maybe at times, to say, hey, I went through the same thing or something similar, and here's how God helped me. But I came up with I thought was an awesome idea by the Holy Spirit when I was preparing for this interview. And I thought, there are so many small groups in churches and they're around all kinds of issues, people's interests or people's problems. And I thought, I don't know that I've ever seen a small group that says, if you've been wounded in the church, come and join our group. We're going to talk about it.
It
And
might be
since
full.
exactly, I think people would be shocked at how many people would actually show up. And
Mm,
even if they're not hurt right now in this particular church, it tends to be people go from church to church to church and don't necessarily resolve those hurts. And they're still carrying those from a previous time, right? And
right.
so it would be a gift to somebody to say, let's open this up and take a look at it because it's affecting your life whether you realize it or not. And I thought, a person could actually use my book as a curriculum. You wouldn't have to
Yes,
come up with a whole new curriculum. Just go through this book and take bits and pieces out of it. And I think it would be very helpful.
absolutely. Connie, God gifted you and anointed you to write this book. I am praying that your book will get out there. Churches need this. I'm just going to bring it up. When I heard about Dr. Tony Evans and Pastor Robert Morris, my heart was broken.
Yeah, me
I
too.
just, I just, I know these things happen, but my mother always said when I was growing up, be sure your sins will find you out. And when
Yes,
you keep sweeping things under the rug, eventually that bump's going to get so big, you're going to trip over it and the truth
yes,
is going to come out. And
yes,
I'm praying for those pastors. I just, and for their churches and their families. This is so devastating to everyone.
it
And for
is.
that precious lady that was so wounded by Pastor Robert Morris, I can you speak to these situations? What is your heart sensing?
In terms of how they can be helped, or in terms of, yeah, I mean, my heart obviously goes out to these people. And what is really difficult is I really struggled with writing this book. It took a long time because I feared God. I didn't want it to be a church bashing book. And I'm sure some of your pastors' wives have struggled with this too, that you don't want to bring shame on the body of Christ. You don't want to bring shame on the church. You don't want to bring shame on yourself. And look at some people stand up and look at they're just vilified, like I talked about before. They're marginalized or they're vilified, like how dare you bring this up, and that
Mhm.
kind of thing. But one of the reasons I have a couple chapters in my book about the problems in the church. I don't go real deep into them because I wanted to concentrate on the healing part, but we have to be honest and say these problems exist.
Mhm.
And a lot of times when you're going through these things, you're saying to yourself, my gosh, doesn't anybody else see what I'm seeing? And nobody seems to be addressing the issue. You feel very alone in it. And then, yeah, and then you end up with a difficult situation like this. So I name many of the issues in the church only for the sake of validating to people, yes, these are real issues, and it's not just your imagination, it's not just you, because after all, you're blaming yourself. Like, what's wrong with me that this bothers me, but it doesn't bother anybody else? You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
These problems have such far-reaching consequences, and a lot of times the attitude is, well, the person left, the problem left the door, right? It went out the door, everything's fine again, right? And yet this person just suffers in silence, oftentimes for years and years. They're by themselves, typically, and you need to realize this is very typical. People don't pursue them. People don't say, oh my gosh, we miss you. You know, you feel like you built all these amazing relationships in the church, and then when you leave, nobody ever even comes and says, "How are you?" or "Can I help you?" It's like, and then you feel very, very alone, and that's sad.
Connie, something that I've noticed is a lot of people that want absolutely nothing to do with church. I've found when you really get to talking with them, it is from unhealed church wounds. And
Absolutely.
there's going to be church wounds because there's hurting people and
Sure.
things are going to happen. But
Right.
can you speak to this? How can we best bring healing and hope to these precious people that have been hurt so deeply? And they're mad at God, they're mad at the church, and it's not God's fault, it's human fault.
Exactly. Yeah, and I told my son that. I says, "I can't believe the things that God gets blamed for sometimes, you know?" And but it's very natural because we sort of see our leadership as representatives of Christ in the earth, which they are.
Mhm.
But we can't put them on a pedestal, and we need to realize we need to get our hearts right with the Lord ourselves in our own personal walk, in our own personal relationship, and so forth. But a lot of our churches are built nowadays on the charisma of the pastor. So look at like Robert Morris and stuff, you know, they're very charismatic people, very, when I say charismatic, I mean the type of personality that's very,
People
open
are
and
drawn to them.
drawn to them. There you go. And there's nothing wrong with that to a point, but then sometimes when that person falls, it's like the whole church falls apart. You're going, wait a minute, there's more to the church than the pastor, and there's more to the church than, the celebrity status of people.
How can we set boundaries and safeguards in our own churches to make sure that our pastor husbands, or if we're not pastors' wives, that these kind of things don't happen?
Yeah, it's a lot of it is in the application process and keeping people accountable throughout their life, throughout their ministry. Um, I've said in the book too, sometimes a pastor is very famous in his congregation, and he's a monster to his family, literally. And it's like, wow, because they've been living a double life, or they're they're doing ministry for the sake of getting adulation and love from the outside. And yet we gotta ask people, what is your priority? And our priorities should be the Lord, our families, and then ministry. That's my opinion, and if you're not able to implement biblical principles in your own life or your own family, then how can you teach other people? And yet at the same time, we also have to be realistic that, like pastors' kids, they got a sort of an unhealthy expectation. They got to be perfect, and all that kind of thing. And so there's got to be a real balance in all of that, because obviously pastors' families, they got struggles. They got kids on drugs. They got kids that are, prodigals. They got all kinds of issues. They deal with issues just like we do, right? And so I think checking in with people in ministry, checking in and say, everything okay? Is there anything that and I like your silently bleeding thing here. It's like it's a wonderful thing because you're creating community where people can talk about these things. Because so often I realize that people in leadership, they don't have anybody to turn to. They're afraid to disclose disclose what they're struggling with, which is
Well, it's a
understandable.
fear. It's a fear for many because it's
Sure.
their job security, their financial security.
Right.
And Connie, what I've found by talking with several pastors' wives that have been or are in abusive situations, people don't believe them. They
Yes.
believe the husband. I know of situations where there are couples that got divorced, and the husband who is so abusive is pastoring today because they
Yes.
blame the wife.
Exactly. That is so awful. It's just awful. And I had it too. There's another aspect I'd like to bring up if I could is spiritual pride and arrogance. Like people like even with divorced people, it's like, well, if you had faith like I had faith, you wouldn't even be divorced. Or if you had faith like I had faith, this never would have happened. And what's your problem? Type of thing. Same with sickness. If you had faith like I had faith, you would have never got sick. Or if you had faith like I had faith, you'd be healed by now.
Right.
And so I think we have to be very, very careful about that kind of arrogance because I believe God judges that because he said, judge not that you be not judged. And in all honesty, I think some pastors are literally falling sick because they've judged the sick, or they're going through
Mhm.
divorce because they've judged the divorced. And so I don't know, it's terrible, isn't it? It's a difficult line that we walk, and all the
And
way
it
around.
it's easy to fall into that judgment
Absolutely.
mentality of thinking, well, you have a prodigal. Well, did you not spend time with your child? What did you what
Right.
and we put that blame on them. And then when it happens to us, it's like, oh, reality check of like, okay, it's a different story. So I agree. I
Yes.
think we have to be so careful that we don't just assume. Assumption is so wrong.
Yes.
Assuming that you did wrong or you this and ask God for wisdom. Lord, help me to really hear what this precious one is going through and not
Yes.
have that assumption that it's their fault.
Exactly. And so often, the whole story hasn't been told. So people know a piece of the story, but they don't know the whole story. Going through divorce or anticipating or going to have to go through it because of abuse or whatever. I said, you know what? Only you can decide what you can live with and what you can't. And we need to remember that. If you were walking in that person's shoes, how much would you be able to put up with? And
Right.
God hates divorce. Nobody likes divorce. I think people that have gone through it are the ones that like it the least
Hmm.
because it's a real tearing because you become as one and then you try to, it affects you body, soul, and spirit. And then you become one. And then all of a sudden you're trying to tear this whole thing apart. It's painful and it affects you every aspect of your life.
Thank you. I agree. God hates divorce, but he hates abuse. And there's all types
Exactly.
of abuse, mental, emotional, physical,
Yes.
spiritual abuse, which happens a lot, when
Yes.
pastors will push that on their wives or I'm the man of the home. I'm God placed me over you and all
Yes.
that kind of stuff. And it's like we're to be submissive to each other. And
Each other. Yeah, I was
yeah,
just gonna say that too. It's like this whole, message of being submissive. It's a two-way street and people find themselves going through things they never dreamed they would go through. I remember being in a church one time and talking to different singles and some of us were going through divorce and this one guy was sitting in the front row all the time and he was so praised because he was standing in faith believing for his marriage. And yet behind the scenes, I knew what was going on. And I mean, he was so angry, he'd literally, tip over the kitchen table and do all kinds of things. And he was praised, and people like me were like, well, you're just treated like a second class citizen or something. And there's something wrong with that picture too.
but God.
But God, that's right. And God never said that we wouldn't go through problems. Everybody goes through problems, but he said he promised to be with us in each and every situation. He's walking with us. He's longing to help us. He said, when you go through troubled waters, call upon me, and I will answer you, and the flood waters won't overtake you. And he says, come boldly to the throne of grace that you might obtain mercy and help in a time of need. And God said that we should hate what he hates and love what he loves. God hates divorce. He hates sin. Look at what it cost him. Look at what it cost everybody. And I tell people, that verse about the wages of sin is death. I said, not only is it spiritual death, sometimes it's physical death, but it's also maybe a piece of your self-respect died. Or
Mm.
maybe it's a piece of your relationship that died. Or maybe it's a piece of your confidence that died. Or maybe it's a piece of your belief that died. It's not always, huge and big. It's these little things that add up and lead us away from the Lord.
Yes. Well, Connie, I so appreciate you joining me today on Silently Bleeding Hope for the Pastor's Wife. I love your book. Again, I do want to encourage people, get the book, share the book. This is anointed and it's going to help you. I don't say that unless I really mean it. And so I'm so grateful you reached out to me and sent me your book, Connie. I've been praying, God, you give me the ladies you want me to interview. And then I get this, like the
Yeah.
same week, I got your email and I
Oh,
was like, okay, God, I'm going to read this book and see if this is what you're doing. And it is. Thank you so much for joining us on Silently Bleeding Hope for the Pastor's Wife. If you need prayer, I'll leave our email address down below. Feel free to email us. And if you have a story that you would like to share, reach out to me, email me, and I will prayerfully consider interviewing you as well. Until next time, my friend, God bless. Thank you for watching Silently Bleeding, Finding Hope for the Pastor's Wife. I look forward to connecting with you. Feel free to leave me comments down below and make sure and subscribe. If you want to know every time a new video is coming out, hit the bell. I would be so delighted if you would also hit the like button and feel free to share this video with anyone you know that this would encourage. Blessings, my friend.